Good day. I'm making this program early on Monday, the 17th of July, because sad events oblige me to leave London. I have to attend the funeral of a dear friend, and the result is that I won't be in London for much of the day. I will be back later in the evening, and I will be in a position to make programs at more usual hours on Tuesday. But the result is I'm making this program early today, and of course it's highly likely that events which will develop over the course of the day will happen, of which I'm not aware at as of the time when I make this video. But there it is, that I'm afraid is how it must be. Now, returning to the perennial topic of these videos now, which is of course the condition of the war, we find that again the last 24 hours have seen fighting in Ukraine take very much the established form. There have been Ukrainian attacks in various places on the southern border, on the southern front lines, in the Backwoods area. All of these attacks have been repulsed by the Russian military. The front lines overall continue to be as previously, with the Russians having not just repelled these attacks, but perhaps advanced to some extent on the northern front lines, and more evidence, accumulating evidence, that this offensive that Ukraine is currently undertaking has achieved no progress, no significant progress at all. As my colleague, my friend, and Brian Beletic at the New Atlas, he often, before he does a video, when he discusses situations on the Ukrainian battlefields, he produces a map, taken, by the way, from Ukrainian sources, which shows the state of the front lines. As he frequently points out, if you home in, if you go very, very close up and look at the details of events, you can see a small amount of movement here and there. But if you zoom out again, then everything looks extremely stable. And that is actually the situation that we find ourselves on the front lines at the moment. Now, I'll just give a brief summary of the state of things, of the state of the fighting, which I've taken from Redovka. Redovka is a Russian newspaper based in Smolensk in Russia, Western Russia. It is obviously very much on the patriotic, nationalist side of the Russian political spectrum. Its accounts of what is going on in the war must therefore be understood in that kind of context, in terms of the context of its biases. It has, as I've discussed many times, good sources about the state of the fighting, and overall I found its reports to be reasonably accurate, and every evening it provides a summary, and this is its latest summary. It says that in the Kupiansk sector, the Russian army has defeated the Ukrainians near Sinkovka and Dvorechnaya. The Russian armed forces are advancing in Novoselovskoye. This is a village, by the way, which is now which the Russians have reached, and which is now fiercely contested. They reached it about 2 days ago, and there's an ongoing battle there. It says that fighting, Redovka goes on to say, fighting continues in the area of Yampolovka and Toskoy. Toskoy is an important town, small town, which the Russians are also reached a couple of days ago as they push towards Kupiansk, and which they're now starting to storm. And anyway, and the Redovka summary goes on to say that the Russians repulsed all attacks of the armed forces of Ukraine to the west of Crimea. So in this part of the front line, the Russians hold the initiative. The Ukrainians have launched counterattacks, but it is the Russians who are advancing, and the initiative is with them. And then it goes on to say, in the Donetsk direction, in the Avdiivka sector, Ukraine unsuccessfully attacked in the direction of Krasnogorovka, Opitnoye, and Vodiany. So these were Ukrainian attacks, but they were repelled. It goes on to say, Redovka goes on to say that positional battles continue in Marinka. Marinka, a long-running battle. The Russians have been trying to capture this small town since October. In fact, they announced briefly in October that they had captured it, which emphatically turns out to have been wrong and untrue. The Ukrainians still control some parts of Marinka on the western suburbs. The Russians have been attacking there. They're making extremely slow progress capturing the rest of Marinka. A few weeks ago, Chechen forces were deployed to Marinka to try to finish off the fighting there, to try to break through Ukrainian defenses. They were first redeployed to deal with the Prigozhin mutiny, which took them to Rostov. And now those Chechen forces have been redeployed to the Bakhmut area, where the Ukrainians have been attacking. And the result is that, again, the advance in Marinka has essentially stopped, but it is the Russian advance. And then the Redovka summary goes on to say, in the Zaporozhye area, the Russian forces have successfully repelled attacks by the Ukrainian military in the Pyatikhatki and Orekhovsky sector. And Ukraine again tried to storm Russian positions in the Staromaysky area. Staromaysky is a village which again the Ukrainians tried to capture in an intense battle. It's on the Vremevsky ledge where this fighting goes on, and Redovka goes on to say the village is under the complete control of the Russian army. As I understand it, what happened was that here, Ukraine, after a lot of intense fighting, reached Staromaysky. This is over the last couple of days. They actually entered this village. Russian forces having withdrawn to the center of the village. Then there was again the Russian counterattack. The Russians drove the Ukrainian forces out of Staromaysky and eventually pushed the Ukrainians back effectively to their original launch lines. So it's important to remember that this is the situation after 6 weeks of a Ukrainian offensive, which was intended to break through the Russian front lines, sever the land bridge to Crimea, and reach the Black Sea. The Ukrainians have achieved no progress, no significant progress in any one of the front lines. In the north, it is they who are in retreat. Redovka, curiously, does not provide a report about the fighting in the Bakhmut area, but other reports that I have seen speak of a significant Russian counterattack underway on the northern flanks of the former Bakhmut, Artyomovsk as it now has become, with the Russians advancing from Berkhovka and pushing the Ukrainians back. And there's been also heavy fighting on the southern flank near Klesheyevka. The Ukrainians have made repeated attempts over the last few weeks to capture Klesheyevka, but again, they've made no progress. So, attempts by Ukraine to advance in various parts of the battlefronts, an offensive that's been underway for 6 weeks, an offensive that was planned to break through in the south, sever the Russian land bridge, essentially engulf Crimea, bring about the collapse of Russian defenses in the south, and none of that has happened, despite the fact that there's been 6 weeks of intense fighting underway, and despite the very heavy losses that Ukraine has suffered. Losses in military equipment, I discussed that in my program yesterday. 20% of all armored vehicles assigned to the offensive, according to the New York Times, destroyed in the first few weeks, and then a further 10% of all assigned armor destroyed over the ensuing weeks. As I said, the New York Times did not provide us with proper time frames for these losses, but there is essentially nothing to show for all this effort. And I would say that one of the facts to take into account about the Ukrainian effort, one of the points that become increasingly clear to me is that we have, perhaps strictly speaking, not one offensive, but 2 offensives underway in parallel with each other. Ukraine is conducting 2 simultaneous offensives, each commanded by what one might almost call rival generals. General Zaluzhny has been obsessed with Crimea ever since the start of the war, indeed even before. He's been single-mindedly focused on this task of capturing Crimea, recapturing Crimea, of severing the Russian land bridge. All his thoughts and energies have been focused on this objective. Back in the summer of last year, as Gordon Hahn has reminded us in that article I touched on yesterday, back last summer, he was already talking about a plan in 2023 to recapture Crimea. In his interview last autumn with The Economist, he was talking about the forces that he would need to recapture Crimea: 300 tanks, 600 to 700 infantry fighting vehicles, 500 howitzers. As I've pointed out several times, he said nothing about air cover in that interview with The Economist, but now he scarcely stops talking about it, and he still talks about Crimea, the importance of retaking Crimea, in articles, interviews that he gives to the Washington Post, as I've also discussed in a recent program. He recently said to the Washington Post that he's going to recapture Crimea, provided he's given the tools to do it, the necessary equipment to do it. He's going to focus on doing that, and he's not going to pay any attention to anybody's concerns in the West about the risks of escalation if that happens, and he's not interested in any concerns that people have that an attack on Crimea might trigger a nuclear response from the Russians and perhaps start World War III. So General Zaluzhny, Commander-in-Chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, is obsessed with Crimea, and his entire objectives, everything that he does, seems to be focused single-mindedly on the objective of recapturing Crimea. And then alongside General Zaluzhny with his Crimea obsession, we have General Syrsky with his Bakhmut obsession. He was defending Bakhmut, right through the autumn and winter and spring, doing so against apparently General Zaluzhny's wishes, but he was fighting continuously to defend what the Ukrainians at that time were calling Fortress Bakhmut. He was committing more and more Ukrainian troops to that battle. Nonetheless, despite all of his efforts, Bakhmut fell on the 20th of May. But ever since then, and indeed even before then, he's been pulling together Ukrainian forces, focusing them on trying to recapture Bakhmut. There's been all of this fighting in and around Bakhmut ever since then. But again, just as General Zaluzhny, despite 6 weeks of effort, has failed to break through the southern front lines, General Syrsky, despite his various claims, has not managed to recapture or surround or bring under fire control or make even any significant progress in trying to recapture Bakhmut. And it's as if these two generals are fighting two completely different wars. Zaluzhny on the southern front lines, where he's got most of the Western equipment and perhaps the cream of the Ukrainian army, but Syrsky fighting in the Bakhmut area with significant other forces, enough to ensure that the fighting there remains extremely intense and very bitter, without, however, achieving any effective results. It's one of the curiosities of the Ukrainian system that Zaluzhny and Syrsky, as I said, who one gets the sense don't get on, with Syrsky always resentful that Zaluzhny, who has a junior rank to himself, Zaluzhny is a major general, Syrsky, as I understand it, is a colonel general, and Syrsky is significantly older than Zaluzhny. Anyway, these two generals seem to be conducting their own wars in parallel and independently of each other, with Zaluzhny never fully able to bring Syrsky to heel, because in his attacks on Bakhmut and in his previous defense of Bakhmut, Syrsky has the backing of President Zelensky in Kiev. And I'm going to suggest also that this strange behavior of Ukraine's two top generals, this obvious rivalry they have with each other, Syrsky's obsession with Bakhmut, which conflicts so much with Zaluzhny's obsession with Crimea, may also in part explain Zaluzhny's strange disappearance over the course of the late spring, early summer. He seems to have gone into a huge sulk, both because he wasn't provided with the air cover he needed or felt he needed for his attack on the southern front lines, but perhaps he was also very, very angry that Syrsky was being allowed to conduct his own war in Bakhmut rather than join in the effort to break the front lines in the south, break through the Russian front lines in the south. But anyway, there it is. It's two major parallel offensives, each ongoing at the same time, and neither achieving any kind of breakthrough in either place that where they're focused. And you can perhaps see some of the reasoning that each of these generals is bringing to their particular obsession. Zaluzhny wants to win the war, or at least that's how he thinks to himself, so he understands that perhaps in order to win the war, the decisive place to try to make a real impression would be through severing the land bridge and encircling Crimea. That's about the only attack that Ukraine can do, which is successful. Might, though it's by no means guaranteed to, compel the Russians to rethink their strategies and perhaps even carry out the kind of unconditional surrender that the Ukrainians want. I'm not sure that Zaluzhny is right about that. It seems to me more likely that it will harden still Russian determination. But at least one can see that if you want to achieve a decisive outcome, then Zaluzhny's offensive in the south is arguably the way to go. And of course, Syrsky, by contrast, can argue that the Russian fortifications in the south are simply too strong. The only place where Ukraine can make or hope to make gains is in the Bakhmut area, where the Russians took control of Bakhmut only a few weeks, basically 2 weeks before the Ukrainian offensive started. They didn't have time to put down dense minefields, heavy fortifications. So it makes more sense for Ukraine to attack there. If you're going to achieve any tactical victories, you're more likely to achieve it in the Bakhmut area than you are on the southern front lines. But in the event, so far, Syrsky hasn't achieved any tactical victories, any significant tactical victories in the Bakhmut area either. I will say this, I get the sense that, though it should be stressed that for the Russians, the fighting on every part of the front lines has been difficult over the last few weeks. It's in the Backwoods area where they've had perhaps their greatest concerns, and where I suspect the disproportion between Russian and Ukrainian losses has been lowest, because the Russians obviously are fighting without the cover of dense minefields and well-established fortified points and that kind of thing. So in a sense, Syrsky's thinking also makes a kind of sense, though recapturing Bakhmut is not going to change the outcome of the war. It might, in theory, be something that is attainable in a way that Zaluzhny's plan to drive to the south and invest Crimea arguably is not. But I would suggest also that even in Bakhmut, this is now a fundamentally mistaken calculus. I'm going to just pluck some numbers out of the air. I don't know what the true proportion of Ukrainian losses to Russian losses is, but let us guess that on the southern front lines, it is 7-1 in the Russians' favor, and let us guess that in the Bakhmut sector, it is 3-1 in the Russians' favor. I suspect that it is in the Russians' favor in the Bakhmut area also, because they are defending there and because they have far more artillery than Ukraine does, and it is, of course, artillery that inflicts the greatest losses. So I would have assumed that the Russians in the Bakhmut area are inflicting heavier losses on the Ukrainians than they are themselves taking. But as I said, let's assume it's 7-1. The proportion of Ukrainian to Russian losses in the south is 7-1, and 3 or even 2-1 in the Russians' favor in the Bakhmut area. I would suggest that this is also, given that we're in an attritional war, an unfavorable, indeed disastrous loss ratio in the Bakhmut area for Ukraine. Because, once again, Ukraine is tying itself up in attrition in order to make tactical advances on the battlefield, which, by the way, it's not so far achieving, but tactical advances which will not have any decisive result. Russia has far more resources than Ukraine does, so it makes no sense for Ukraine to conduct its operations in a way that causes it to have more losses than the Russians have by attacking even in the Bakhmut area in the way that it is. A loss ratio of 2-1 or 3-1 in Russia's favor strategically works over time to Russia's advantage, not to Ukraine's. So anyway, two offensives being conducted essentially at the same time by two rival generals. Perhaps in theory, it might have made more sense for the Ukrainians to concentrate their forces in conducting one offensive rather than attacking in two offensives, but President Zelensky doesn't seem able to overrule either one of these generals. He finds himself obliged to go along with both. Anyway, two parallel offensives, neither of which is achieving anything. And as each general, Zaluzhny in the south, Syrsky in the Bakhmut area, act out their particular obsession, the Russians continue their advance in the north towards Kupiansk and Liman and those places, though in contrast to the Ukrainians, they're going about their advance in a methodical and incremental way. That, it seems to me, is the situation on the battlefronts at the moment. Now, the United States, which has been sponsoring Ukraine, backing Ukraine, I think understands the situation very well. And I think in Washington, there's increasing amount of recrimination and argument about this. The article that I discussed in the New York Times yesterday, the one that spoke about Ukraine's change of tactics, the one which I pointed out did not admit to the fact that the tactics which Ukraine abandoned of hurling armored formations into minefields under fire was one that the United States had actually told Ukraine to adopt, but one which failed disastrously. Anyway, I think the United States is already increasingly understanding that the situation in Ukraine is not going well at any place in this offensive, and that the prospects of any sort of breakthrough are looking increasingly remote. And we've had another analysis, apparently another explanation of, in the US media, I haven't been able to find it, but I've seen reports about it, which provide the reason, supposedly, why the offensive, specifically the offensive in the south, and it's clear, by the way, that in this battle between Zaluzhny and Syrsky, the Americans backed Zaluzhny against Syrsky and allocated to him the cream of the armored vehicles that Zaluzhny used in the southern offensive. Anyway, the US is now coming up with a new rationalization for Ukraine's failure, and that is apparently the difficulty of penetrating Russian minefields. This is the reason why Ukraine's offensive has slowed to a crawl, and the problem is supposedly that all the mine clearing equipment that the West provided to Ukraine has not been sufficient to penetrate these minefields, and the Russians, of course, they target the mine clearing vehicles that advance or that seek to clear pathways through the minefields. They target these mine clearing vehicles with artillery, with anti-tank missiles, with their helicopter gunships, and mine clearing equipment, as a result, has a very low survival rate on the southern battlefronts, and that has caused the Ukrainians to send sappers, individual sappers, to try to clear the mines one at a time, often, by the way, at heavy loss to themselves. And of course, the other problem they face is that even as they clear mines, the Russians are able remotely to lay more of them. And the Russians now have various devices, various machines that are able to scatter mines in any particular area. This is steppe land, partly grassland. You can scatter mines by air, and they will be concealed by the grass. The mines themselves are green-coloured and therefore not easily detectable through the grass. And of course it is also summer, so that makes it easier to conceal these mines in the long grass. And the result is that the offensive has slowed to a crawl. Well, this is a pure rationalization. The United States knew about these minefields before the offensive was launched. It's had experience itself in dealing with minefields. It ought to know how difficult minefields are to navigate. And given the discrepancy in firepower, the fact that the Russians have far more artillery than Ukraine, the fact that the Russians have control of the air, it ought not to have been difficult to foresee that mine-clearing vehicles attempting to clear pathways through these minefields would be the target of Russian attack and would be destroyed, and destroyed very quickly, by the Russians, essentially bringing the offensive to a stop. In effect, what the Americans are here complaining about is simply that the Russians developed a rational plan to deal with the Ukrainian offensive. They not only laid minefields, but they came up with an obvious plan of how to deal with any Ukrainian armored thrusts aiming to punch through these minefields, destroy the mine-clearing vehicles. It seems that the United States failed to anticipate either that the Russians would develop such an obvious plan, and that they would have the willpower and the determination and the skill, because there can never have been any doubt that they had the resources to carry it out. Once again, the United States seriously underestimated Russian intelligence and resourcefulness on the battlefield. That is all that this explanation actually tells us. So, the United States sees this offensive failing to achieve the sort of breakthroughs that it perhaps anticipated or expected or hoped that it would. And we can see the recriminations now starting to develop behind the scenes, the cracks within NATO that Gordon Hahn was talking about in that long article that he gave, the cracks that John Helmer has also been talking about. There is uncertainty about what to do. There's concern also that supplying Ukraine with more weapons is not going to change the outcome of the war. The Defense Intelligence Agency has given advice to that effect. It said that you can supply long-range missiles, but they're not going to change the situation on the battlefronts. We see that the United States is already out of conventional artillery ammunition, so they've been forced to supply cluster munitions instead, which is actually an admission of failure. And incidentally, as has also been pointed out to me, the cluster munitions the United States is supplying are relatively old, some of them 20 years old. The shelf life of ammunition in storage is assumed to be roughly 20 years. It might not be in particularly good condition, even allowing for the fact that the United States is likely to have stored it under what might be considered optimal conditions, and even allowing for the fact that it's probably been subjected to periodic inspections. And, well, Douglas Macgregor, Scott Ritter, and others have spoken about how cluster munitions are not as effective in this kind of fighting as conventional munitions are. And besides, I also understand that cluster munitions have shorter range than conventional munitions do, especially if launched from multiple rocket launch systems. And that might be important because if you go back again to the discussions that took place in the early summer of last year, when the United States first started supplying artillery pieces to Ukraine, first M777 howitzers and then HIMARS rocket systems, I can remember very well that at that time, one of the claims which was made about the US artillery and the US rocket systems which were being supplied was that they had longer range than the Russians, and that meant that Ukraine would from henceforth be able to outrange the Russians in the artillery battle. Ukraine might not be able to launch as many shells and rockets as the Russians do, but it would be able to strike at the Russians from longer distances and with greater accuracy. Like so many claims that have been made about Western weapons, that proved essentially wrong. The Russians also have long-range artillery, even though they emphasize volumes to a much greater extent than the United States does on the battlefields, but the Russians do have some artillery that is as long-ranged as that which the United States has supplied to Ukraine. But anyway, we're now in a situation where, if these reports that I'm getting about the range of cluster munitions is true, we've now reversed ourselves. We've gone from supplying long-range munitions, long-range artillery, and claiming that that was going to be a decisive factor in the war, to supplying short-range munitions and short-range artillery systems, and again claiming that this will be in some way decisive in the war. The extent to which, if one takes the trouble to keep track of claims that people in the West have made about particular Western systems and about particular Western tactics, the West reverses, or at least Western commentary reverses its claims without acknowledging the fact, can sometimes make one's head spin over the course of this particular conflict. But anyway, there we are. So, much discussion, much concern in the United States about the direction of events. No real plan, as I've discussed many times, about what to do next. A general acknowledgement that the United States cannot afford to become directly involved in the fighting. A decision to push back on President Zelensky's constant attempts to try to involve the United States and, of course, NATO in the fighting by getting Ukraine's entry into NATO fast-tracked in some way. The United States wasn't happy with that. It's pushed back on that. It's kicked the question of Ukraine's NATO membership into the long grass. There's actually been a rather tetchy statement from the White House over the course of the last 24 hours, saying that the question of Ukraine's NATO membership has now been decided and that there really isn't anything further to discuss. Anyway, an unwillingness by the United States to become directly involved, but at the same time, an understanding that Ukraine cannot achieve victory on the battlefields, that the great offensive of the summer, spring and summer, is not achieving or bringing about that victory, and that the United States has no real plan any longer about how that victory is to be achieved, given that economic and financial pressures on Russia, the sanctions war, have already failed, but also an understanding that any negotiation process with the Russians, which is the only rational way forward, is going to be very, very difficult and very, very complicated. And could very well result in an outcome for the United States which the United States would not be happy with and which would be embarrassing for the United States. And all of this in what is an election year, with the 2024 election now gradually coming over the horizon, and with the political battle in Washington more intense than I have ever known it in my lifetime, with partisan conflicts and disagreements between the various political factions in Washington at absolute fever pitch. And one can see, or one can foresee, that even as things in Ukraine deteriorate, the various factions in Washington will be out to blame each other for the coming debacle. There was another fairly tetchy comment from the White House saying that the United States has not lost moral leadership by supplying cluster munitions to Ukraine, cluster munitions which the United States once said that if the Russians were using in the fighting in Ukraine, that would amount to a war crime. Cluster munitions which are prohibited in most of the world, cluster munitions which the United States' own European allies say they will not supply, and which they say that they do not think the United States should supply. Despite that, the White House has said that they're supplying cluster munitions, they're not losing moral leadership by doing so, and by supplying those cluster munitions, they're doing what they can to ensure that Ukraine doesn't run out of weapons over the course of the war. Weapons supposedly to defend itself. And one can see the insinuation that the critics of this decision to supply cluster munitions in the United States are aiming to starve Ukraine of weapons, and so that if Ukraine is defeated, it will be they who are to blame because they prevented the continued supply of weapons from the United States. And one can also see attempts by the US to shift the blame, by the administration at least, to try and shift the blame, not just onto its own political opponents in Washington, but also these strange rationalizations of the failure on the battlefronts, the fact that Ukraine hasn't been able to clear the mines, the fact that Ukraine adopted the wrong tactics at the start of the offensive without any recognition that it was the United States which told Ukraine to adopt those tactics in the first place. So that's, it seems to me, where we are at the moment in the war. I would add that with every day there have been more Russian attacks, drone attacks and missile attacks across Ukraine, and Russian telegram channels, Slavyangrad especially, but others also, have been carrying many articles about the expansion and evolution of Russia's fleet of kamikaze drones, the Lancet, and more sophisticated versions of the Lancet that are coming over the horizon. And these are proving increasingly deadly in attacks on Ukrainian armoured vehicles, and indeed vehicles of all kinds, as they approach the front lines. And we're told about drone swarms, Russian drone swarms, appearing very soon at various points over the front lines. In other words, numbers of these drones are going to increase exponentially over the next few weeks or months, exactly at the time when Ukrainian artillery is becoming increasingly forced to using cluster munitions, which I am told will bring those Ukrainian artillery pieces closer to the battlefronts within the range of those drones, those Russian kamikaze drones, the Lancet and the more sophisticated versions of the Lancet that are now coming over the horizon. Anyway, that's the situation as far as I can see as of now on the battlefronts. Ukraine pushing hard everywhere, Zaluzhny and Syrsky conducting their offensives in parallel with each other, neither achieving a breakthrough, both expending huge amounts of men and munitions on these offensives, the Russians getting stronger, and the United States uncertain what to do, perhaps recognizing that negotiations will have to begin at some point over the next few weeks and months, perhaps waiting for Ukraine to announce that the offensive has come to a stop before the negotiations get underway, looking perhaps to start these negotiations at some point towards the end of the year, but no negotiating strategy to speak of, no willingness to talk about the issue of Ukraine's membership of NATO. In fact, the Vilnius summit ended with a communique that defiantly insisted that Ukraine's eventual place was in NATO. So the Russians have insisted that Ukraine's neutral status be permanently enshrined in agreements between itself and the United States. But the United States has categorically rejected that. It says that for the United States, an open door to NATO membership is some sort of principle that must be protected at all costs. Already, that seems to be an irreconcilable difference. There doesn't seem to be a clear way for the United States to come to a compromise over this in a way that would not result in a major loss of face to the Russians, even as the situation deteriorates. And the United States also has insisted that it will never agree to recognize any Russian territorial gain in the conflict in Ukraine. The communique, the Vilnius communique, also speaks about the fact that Crimea remains Ukrainian and that this is the united position of all NATO states and will remain so. However, we also see that the Russians have so far successfully defended all attempts to attack Crimea. There were, by the way, more drone attacks on Crimea over the last 24 hours, Ukrainian drone attacks. The Ukrainians sent both sea and air drones towards Crimea. The Russians say that they intercepted all of these drones or were able to jam all of these drones, rendering them ineffectual. And incidentally, on the subject of kamikaze drones, the reason it seems why Russian kamikaze drones like the Lancet are so effective on the battlefronts, whereas the various kamikaze drones that the United States have supplied to Ukraine have not been effective at all. Apparently the major reason for this is because of Russia's extremely advanced electronic warfare capabilities. They're able to jam the guidance systems, the communications of American-supplied kamikaze drones, whereas Ukraine doesn't have electronic warfare systems capable of doing the same thing to the far more numerous Russian kamikaze drones like the Lancet. But anyway, Ukraine cannot recapture Crimea, but the United States has indefinitely committed itself to a position where it will never recognize Russian control of Crimea. The best that some officials in the United States seem able to come up with is a proposal that the conflict be frozen in some way, that there should be some kind of armistice agreement on Korean war lines. In other words, the Russians be left in de facto but unrecognized control of roughly 20% of Ukrainian territory, and that the front lines be frozen, and that the United States be given freedom to go on arming and equipping the Ukraine that's left thereafter, and perhaps even integrating it into NATO in some ways, with talk that the United States might even eventually go down the pathway that it did with West Germany, integrating West Germany into NATO, as happened in 1955, even as the West German government of that era did not control the whole of German territory, with the Russians having set up a rival Germany in the east, the former East German Democratic Republic. Well, why should the Russians agree to that? It doesn't make any kind of sense. I've pointed this out in previous programs. Why would the Russians help the Americans out of their current difficulties by agreeing to freeze the conflict in that kind of way? And the Russians have flatly rejected any such proposal. They say that they are not interested in freezing the conflict in that fashion. They want something altogether different. They want a settlement of the conflict in Ukraine that satisfies the objectives that President Putin outlined at the beginning of the fighting in February 2022, a neutral status for Ukraine enshrined in legal documents, the demilitarization of Ukraine, the denuclearization of Ukraine, and what Putin calls the denazification of Ukraine, the purging of Ukraine of all holders of this ideology left over from the 1930s, which continues to have sway there, and of course ultimately protection for Russian speakers within Ukraine, and if not de jure recognition by Ukraine of its loss of Crimea and the Donbass, and now the four regions, at the very least de facto recognition of that also. The Russians have made it absolutely clear that as far as they are concerned, these are the key demands that must be satisfied for the conflict to end, and the United States both has ruled out agreeing to any one of these demands, whilst at the same time finding itself in a position where it cannot force on the Russians a change of position in that kind of way. So there we are. We are, in effect, at an impasse. The United States has no coherent negotiation strategy, even though at some level it understands that negotiations are inevitable. It's now cooling on the idea of supplying F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. It's worried that if it does supply those fighter jets, the conflict in Ukraine will not change its course, and many of those fighter jets will be rapidly destroyed by the Russian military. I've seen lots of claims that, in fact, condition of Ukrainian airfields is not suitable for the operation of these fighter jets from Ukrainian territory. And there's no real explanation of how, if they're ever delivered to Ukraine, they would be used, or in what way, or what they would be precisely intended to do. The United States, in addition, also faces warnings from the Russians that, as far as the Russians are concerned, the F-16s that are being delivered are dual use. They're capable of operating nuclear weapons. Foreign Minister Lavrov has warned the United States that, from a Russian perspective, this would be a nuclear escalation, supplying these kind of aircraft to Ukraine. And he's also reminded the United States that the Russian doctrine might even make it acceptable for the Russians to use nuclear weapons preemptively if they conclude that there is a serious risk that they could be threatened with a nuclear attack themselves. I don't think, actually, that Lavrov is seriously threatening nuclear retaliation if the F-16s are delivered, but at least it's another warning that the Russians are giving, that they will look ill upon the supply of these aircraft to Ukraine, and that must also be complicating US decision making to some extent. So it seems to me that the United States is in a difficult position. As I said, as election year looms over the horizon, it's failed to break Russia economically, it's failed to break Russia militarily. The trend of events on the battlefronts is now pointing increasingly towards a Russian victory. There may be hopes of trying to delay that until the 2024 election is out of the way, but that might be extremely difficult to do and might require levels of military escalation which some people in the United States might not be happy with, and levels of military commitment with which some people in the United States might not be happy with. The United States does not, however, want to become directly involved in the fighting. It's leery about giving the green light to its East European allies, Poland and Lithuania, for them to become involved, because it fears that that might cause the United States itself to be dragged in. But it has no clear, acceptable endgame, no real plan of what to do in this situation that it faces now. And it could be that there are other problems as well that are existing which are affecting US policy in all sorts of ways, of which I myself am not aware and of which the world in general is not aware. There continues to be, for example, a certain degree of mystery about Janet Yellen's trip to Beijing. It was a very strange trip. It was announced in the United States that Janet Yellen was heading to China, and this announcement to some extent came out of the blue. It didn't seem to fit in at all with the negotiating strategy, or at least the outreach strategy that the United States had made towards China. Secretary Blinken had been to China, he'd been chewed up there. President Biden then made all sorts of critical comments about China, about Xi Jinping being a dictator and all of that. The Chinese were said to be very angry about that. Ideas of a summit meeting between Xi Jinping and President Biden were effectively put on ice. Summit meeting was supposed to happen in October. The Chinese have now pointedly said that President Xi will indeed have a summit meeting in October, but it won't be with President Biden. It will be with President Putin of Russia instead, with an invitation to President Putin to travel to Beijing, which apparently President Putin has agreed to do in October. And then, as I said, in the midst of this heated argument, sudden announcement that Janet Yellen was traveling to Beijing. And then she did travel to Beijing. And it all became very curious because originally I understood that she was going to be there for 2 days. I then heard that she was there actually for 4. It was not entirely clear who she met when she was there. She did meet the Chinese Prime Minister, Mr. Li Qiang, but there's no record of her meeting with Xi Jinping himself, no statements to that effect. It's not even clear which Chinese officials that she did meet, presumably the head of the central bank, presumably the finance minister, her opposite number. There was no banquet at the Great Hall of the People. Now, this is not an obligation. The Chinese are not obliged to lay on banquets for distinguished visitors, but they often do. My father, many years ago, when he headed a rather low-ranking delegation from Greece, small country, to China, This is some years before he passed away. Anyway, he was hosted by the Chinese authorities at the Diaoyutai guest house, and he attended a banquet there. He was invited to a banquet there, and maybe he was a distinguished visitor, but obviously he was not a person of Janet Yellen's importance, not by any stretch. Yet he did participate in some kind of a banquet, though it was held in the guest house, not in the Great Hall of the People, as a banquet hosting Janet Yellen would have presumably been. And the other thing, the even stranger thing, was that the Chinese media seemed to downplay the visit. It received surprisingly little coverage in the Chinese media. And we had lots of statements from Yellen, none of them particularly interesting, but she did go out of her way to say that decoupling from China was impossible, that it was not something that the United States could realistically or seriously do. And then she returned to the United States, and it was very difficult to understand why she went back. Well, there's been a very intriguing theory about the visit, which has now been expressed by Tom Longo, a market player in the United States, somebody who understands markets, financial markets, something which I don't in any way pretend to do. He's come up with an explanation for Yellen's visit, which actually, in itself, if it's true, does answer many of these mysteries about this visit. He says that over the last couple of weeks, there has been a looming crisis in the bond markets. And he said that a couple of days ago, there was a sudden shift there was a big move in the financial markets, very big move of a kind that it is impossible could happen by itself. It suggests the intervention of a very powerful market player. And the effect of this move was that this looming crisis in the bond markets, I should stress, he means the sovereign debt markets, particularly in Europe, that this crisis dissipated as a result of this rather strange market move. And most of the media linked it to an announcement of better than expected inflation numbers in the United States, but he pointed out that the actual numbers released were hardly different from what previous market expectations had assumed that they would be, and that they did not explain this big move in the markets that took place then. And Longo has suggested that what happened was that with this looming crisis in the bond markets starting to get out of control, I don't pretend I understand the mechanics of this very well, but with this crisis happening, Yellen rushed effectively to Beijing, met senior people there, we don't know which people, and got their agreement for China to buy bonds, most in particular US treasuries, and that this is the purpose of this visit, to get the Chinese to step in and allay the crisis in the sovereign debt markets. At least, I hope I've understood this properly. That's my understanding of what Tom Longo is saying, and he's explained it in various fora. You can find, if you go to his website, you will find a more clear-cut explanation there of what he says happened than the one which I can provide. And he said that if the Chinese did agree to what Yellen was demanding, or requesting, rather I should say, not demanding, requesting, then of course they will have demanded something in return. And of course we don't know what that is. And Tom Longo speculates that it might have been a rowback, for example, of some kind over the conflict in Ukraine, or of course it could have been something else. Now, as I said, this is very speculative, but it is an interesting speculation. At least I do find it an interesting speculation, because it would explain why Yellen suddenly went to Beijing, why she was there for apparently 4 days, why the discussions took place in private. If you're going to be planning some big move in the markets, you don't want word of that to spread to the markets before it happens, because that might undermine what you're trying to do, and it might explain the limited coverage in the Chinese media. Again, the Chinese would probably not want to publicize the fact that they were in discussions with the United States about engaging in that kind of a big market move, if that really was what happened. And it might also explain why there wasn't a banquet, because a banquet in China can be, doesn't have to be, but it normally is a public affair. And of course, if there was a banquet, there might be some interest in who was attending, with the Chinese authorities avoiding providing very much detail about whom Janet Yellen met exactly while she was in Beijing. So I find this an intriguing idea, an intriguing theory. As I said, we must stress that it's speculation. I don't know, Tom Longo doesn't know, and doesn't pretend that he knows, that this was actually what happened. But it does make a kind of sense. Now, if this did indeed happen, or something like that happened, then of course we can say indeed that July has indeed been a decisive month. We've seen the failure of Ukraine's offensive. It's becoming increasingly unlikely that that will change, and President Putin, in certain comments he's now made in a television show, comments which are unlikely, by the way, to be reproduced on the Kremlin's website. But anyway, he has definitively said, apparently, that the Ukrainian offensive has failed. Well, that might be premature, but it seems that that was what he said. But we've seen the failure of the offensive up to now. We've seen the astonishing admission of the United States that it is out of ammunition. And even more importantly, we would have had the United States coming to Beijing to try to gain Chinese support to stabilize the financial markets at a time of severe stress, and having to make some sort of concessions in return. Now, I'm not sure that if Tom Longo's interpretation of events is indeed correct, that the concessions that the Chinese would have demanded of the United States would indeed have related to the situation in Ukraine, to the conflict there. It's not impossible, and there is a historic precedent. There's a lot of myth making about this issue. There's a lot of mythology about this, but it does seem that during the 1956 Suez crisis, the United States did put financial pressures on the British government to cause it to back off in its campaign against Egypt and the government of President Nasser. So it wouldn't be the first time something like this has happened, that pressure has been exerted through the financial markets in order to elicit a change in a government's behavior. But it would be a very interesting thing if this was something that was done to the United States, in this case by China, as opposed to having been done by the United States to someone else. Well, who knows? But it is intriguing, and it does suggest that there's an awful lot more, at least, and of this I am confident, going on behind the scenes than we know about. And of course, when Putin does travel to Beijing in October, he will be meeting with Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping will be discussing with Putin the situation in the conflict in Ukraine. China has already made clear that it is not going to put pressure on Russia over the conflict in Ukraine. We'll be seeing what the nature of those discussions is when we come closer to that time. Anyway, this is where I bring my video today to an end. I will just add one last point, which is that to my knowledge, the Russians are still sticking with their position that they're not going to renew the grain deal over the course of today. We will see if that is the case. The last grain ship before the expiry of the deadline has apparently left Odessa. Apparently there are now fewer and fewer ships prepared to charter cargoes, to take cargoes from Ukraine. The grain deal seems to be in its last hours. There was apparently a very friendly discussion about this issue between Putin and President Ramaphosa of South Africa. But obviously, as to what actually happens with the grain deal, well, that's a topic to be discussed in my next video. You will know more about it in advance than I do now when I'm making this video early this morning today. Well, that's me. And can I just again repeat that you could find all our programs, including of course this one, on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can also go to our shop and buy yourself the amazing things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, all of those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon, and have a very good day.